Welcome to the Get Trauma Informed podcast, dedicated to unraveling the complexities of trauma, its pervasive impact, and the journey towards holistic recovery and realignment. If your radiance has ever felt muted, like I and thousands of others, you're in the right place to reignite your inner light. I'm your host, Wellness Coach Liz Blanding, and this is the Get Trauma Informed podcast. Well, hello, and welcome to another episode of Mini Trauma Recovery Talks. And in our mini talks, we pulled nuggets from our full episodes to hone in on some of the key points and some of the key nuggets that some of our guests are dropping, some of our guest experts are dropping here. So today we wanted to talk a little bit about overcoming commitment issues caused by unresolved trauma. You see, oftentimes we're walking through life and we're living life through a trauma lens. And a trauma lens makes the whole picture distorted, like that of when we used to be children and we look through the kaleidoscopes, and when you look through the picture, it's foggy. So oftentimes we're making decisions based on the view or our vantage point from a trauma lens. Okay. And so when we talk about commitment issues and trauma, we're talking about how trauma can manifest in difficulties with commitment in relationships. And it can be relationships in interpersonal relationships. It can be relationships in regards to work. It can be in your relationship, your personal self, your personal goals. So let's give an example of what that looks like. So you set a goal that you want to maybe let's go to write the book. We've been talking a lot about the Pathway to Trauma Recovery book and book study, and we've been talking about, the support group. So let's talk a little bit about your goal is to write that book, right? And you start to write the book, but then you don't commit to the long term. You don't commit to finishing it, right? And you don't keep that commitment to yourself. And then you have this self-talk, and either you beat yourself up with your self-talk, or you might, just ask yourself the big question: why am I not able to finish anything that I start? Well, maybe it might take taking a step back to go back to see where this started, or what is the root of this? Why is it that I cannot keep the commitment to myself, right? Now let's talk a little bit about, traumatic experiences that disrupt the ability to form secure attachments or lead to fear of commitment. So a traumatic incident can cause that emotional attachment issue, right? So let's talk about the fight, flight, freeze, or fawn response. These are stress responses. These are trauma triggers. These are survival mechanisms that can cause or result in avoidance or difficulty with long-term commitment. So are you in a relationship and out of a relationship, in a relationship and out of a relationship because something happens and it's either black or white? There is no middle ground. And I'm sure that a lot of you can identify with that, because that's where I lived when I was in my most unhealthy self. I could not see the gray area. I could only see black or white. And if there was some gray area, I couldn't see it. I honestly could not see it. So that's what it looks like when you're on fight, flight, freeze, or fawn mode. There is a fawn in there as well, sort of like, you are in kind of that like people pleasing mode. That's kind of like sort of like a helpless kind of people pleasing mode. You want to get along with everybody, right? You want everything to be all right. You don't want any type of conflict or any type of anything, but you go straight to that mode, or you go straight to the fight mode. Like you got your boxing gloves on and you want to fight. Or freeze. I've been in that. And see, when I was going through my deepest bouts of trauma, I want to say when I was in my deepest bouts, I could experience all three of those or all four of those at one time. The fight would happen. The flight, I'm ready to go. The freeze, I am totally frozen in my tracks, can't move. And the fawn, I want this situation to be okay. Let me do what I have to do to people please. And that's what it looked like. And yes, when you're on the outside looking in, it looks like that person is coming unwired. And yes, that's how I felt. But imagine being on that red panic button 24/7, 24/7, you're on that. Those are your response. Those are your survival mechanisms that have kicked in, and you're constantly there. You're not even being triggered, and you're there. And see, oftentimes we're suffering in silence because we don't know that help is available. But I'm here to tell you, coaching is what helped get me from being in silent suffering, and not actually. Let me go even back further, not even being aware of my trauma, but then moving from being aware of it and not knowing where to go to get help. How do I get help when I'm going to my therapist? And I think therapists have an amazing position, amazing place, an amazing place in the recovery process. But oftentimes it takes a team of people to help you to really understand where you are, understand what happened to you, because I'm one of those type of people. I need to understand the root cause. I need to understand, where did this come from? How did this happen? How do I get out of it? What is my plan, right? What is my self-care plan to help me understand each component of this? And that's where I was. So to help me get out of the fight, fight, freeze, or fawn, it took extensive coaching. And as I started walking through that, it became a passion of mine to be able to share this, to be able to share this freeing feeling with other people, and how and be able to walk into your freedom, to be able to walk into that. I get so passionate about that. But let's come back here. Okay, so we're going to talk about fear of vulnerability and intimacy. Oh, goodness, that's a big one right there. Unresolved trauma creates barriers to vulnerability, making emotional closeness and long term commitments feel overwhelming and unsafe. And I can see that, where once upon a time, there was a time when I would fear being vulnerable, or I would fear intimacy, because that way intimacy makes you vulnerable, right? And if you're vulnerable, you can be hurt. And if you've been hurt time and time and time again, that's where that complex PTSD comes in, where it's an issue, a trauma, and a trauma. But let me tell you, there's freedom on the other side of that. So you don't have to stay in that silent suffering, right? So that fear of vulnerability or long-term commitments, and it's not that you don't want love, you actually do want love, but you're afraid of it. So you're in that constant, again, going back to that trauma response of fight, or you're in fear, right? So let's talk about a little bit about trauma bonding and healthy commitments. There is a difference between a trauma-driven relationship, right? Or a trauma-driven attachment versus a healthy commitment. A healthy commitment or healthy relationship, it is built on mutual trust, security, and long-term vision. That's why it's important to have those conversations, so that you can really, I go back to, in relationships, the courtship. The courtship part is about getting to know one another and getting to know the ups, the downs, the pros, the cons. And oftentimes, I talk about this quite often, when you go into a sexually committed relationship, or that type of an intimate relationship, it's like putting blinders on. It's like putting a fog over you, because now we go into the euphoria of how good that feels, the attachment. But hold on, wait a minute, pump the brakes. We haven't even gotten over to the get to know, like, and trust you factor. So now what do? We set ourselves up for failure, but that's what society says. It says, go for the gusto. In the movies, you see one date and now they're in the bed. You see maybe a couple dates, and that's the expectation. But nobody got to know, when I wake up, am I still going to like you or not? And I know today's mini trauma talk is going to be a little bit, no, we're going to talk real, right? And this is what happens. And I know in today's world, it's a challenge, right? Because everybody's expectation is me jump in the bed. That's not always the best, especially if you've gone through trauma, right? And then you start forming these unhealthy connections, these different ties. We're not even go to the spiritual side of it at this point, but we're going to have a whole show on what it means to bond with somebody without going into that. You can actually create a deeper bond with someone before you have a sexual relationship with them. Let's put that down. Let's put a note down to go into that a little bit deeper. But let's get through this one today. Overcoming commitment issues caused by unresolved trauma. Okay, so we can also go into self-sabotage, and going to self-sabotage. And we'll talk about that a little bit in relationships, what that looks like. But it is like, Your unresolved trauma can lead to you self-sabotaging behaviors. And these behaviors undermine efforts towards committing in various aspects of life. And it doesn't just have to be in a relationship. Okay. There are many steps to recovery and to building trust. And some of those techniques that we can go into, it is overcoming that commitment of fear. And how do we overcome that commitment of fear? There are a lot of therapeutic approaches to that, and getting involved with a trauma-informed counselor, trauma-informed coach can help you to address the root cause of the commitment issues. Okay. There are, like I said, there are many individuals that I have worked with that this is their story, and they live in the trauma behind that glass wall of trauma, and it's very, very challenging to move from that over into freedom, right? Some of the things that commitment phobia is also linked to unresolved trauma. And this is what we do. This is what it looks like. It looks like avoiding long-term relationships. It looks like frequent breakups, ending relationships abruptly when they start to become emotionally serious, or when deep intimacy is expected. And again, I'm from the school of thought that intimacy can happen without sex. And I'm not saying that sex is a bad thing. That's the elixir to hold the relationship together, to bring the relationship back together. But it should not be what you jump into right off the rip, because you have not built that bond, that connection. You have not built that enough to jump into a sexual relationship. And I know folks are going to have a lot to say about that, because a lot of people are not going to agree with me, right? However, that's the school of thought that I'm from, right? So we talked about frequent breakups, fear of vulnerability, avoiding emotional closeness, keeping partners at a distance, and struggling to open up about your feelings. And this is all, again, going back to unresolved trauma. We talked about trauma sitting and becoming festering, because it's not going away. It's just sitting there festering, and all of a sudden one day, boom, it's right there in your face. So we don't want to have fear of vulnerability. We don't want to sabotage our relationships, right? Or push our partners away. Inconsistent behavior, again, a sign. These are all signs, right? Inconsistent behavior, escalating between an intense affection and sudden withdrawal, often confusing or frustrating to the partner. Let's sit with that for a minute. Oftentimes, relationships are or the partners are inconsistent in behavior. Okay, and that's oscillating between intense affection and then sudden withdrawal, and that there is confusing and very, very frustrating. However, remember, relationships are work. So oftentimes you want to see, everybody's going to come with their pile of stuff, and you have to decide or determine, is that pile of stuff worth it, right? Can you form a healthy relationship with that person's stuff, your stuff? Are you willing to work through it together, right? The fear of loss of independence is huge. That's a huge one. Viewing commitment as a threat to your personal freedom, right? Leading to reluctancy to move forward in a relationship, right? That's another, fear of losing independence. Okay. Difficulty in planning for the future, avoiding discussions about future plans or commitments like marriage, children, or moving in together. All of these are signs of unresolved trauma. Chronic distrust. Ooh, that's a big one. Struggling with trust issues, consistently fearing abandonment or betrayal, often rooted in past traumatic experiences. Hence, the root cause of a lot of relationships that could have been beautiful, but because they were built on trauma or unresolved trauma, they end up falling apart or breaking up like a glass. Over focusing on careers or hobbies, using work, hobbies, or other distractions as a way to avoid intimacy and commitment in personal relationships. I tell y'all, this list that we just went over has been very, very eye-opening, right? When we study, we learn more, not only about the other person, but we learn about ourselves as well. So I hope this mini trauma recovery talk has helped us to even if it just took us a little step further towards saying, wait a minute, recognizing some of the signs as to what unresolved trauma looks like when it comes to commitment. All righty. We'll see you on the next episode. Bye for now. It's time to buckle up. No more suffering in silence. Our Power Pack journey to recovery and realignment starts now. Remember, you were collateral damage on someone else's warpath. Trauma is not your fault. Recovery, however, is your responsibility. I'm your host, Wellness Coach Liz Blanding, and this is the Get Trauma Informed podcast.